Hey everybody, I'm here today to talk about actions by the Georgia Environmental Protection Division to provide water for endangered freshwater mussels in the agricultural region of the Lower Flint River Basin, and this is in Georgia. So actually, let me back up 1 second. Before I really get going on my presentation, I'd like to quickly describe what an irrigation reduction auction is. And what that is a tool used to reduce the amount of water used for irrigation in a growing season. And in order to do that, there's a payment to farmers to not irrigate for a season, even though they're permitted and able to irrigate normally. So my presentation, I'm going to talk about my motivation for research, provide a little bit of the policy context that sort of drives management of these mussels, talk about the methods that we used for the research, provide you with a bit of initial results, and based on the results, provide recommendations for policy changes. So a bit about the motivation. This first image on the very left is the entire state of Georgia, and for every dot, that is one permit that's provided by the Environmental Protection Division, or EPD, to farmers to use water for irrigation. And if you zoom in, you can see this really dense cluster of permits. And zoom in even further, you can see that these permits about saturate the landscape. And so this is what the landscape sort of looks like in this area. For every permit, there's a well pumping up water to irrigate crops. And so this region is the Lower Flint River Basin, where we're doing this research. And in this region, there happens to be a really high amount of freshwater mussel diversity. And there are 5 mussels that are protected through the Endangered Species Act. There's the Gulf moccasin shell, the shiny rayed pocketbook, the purple bank climber, oval pigtoe, and fat three-ridge. These are pretty unassuming looking creatures, but they've made for a huge impact on agricultural operations in the area. One important thing to point out, so in these red circles, this is the primary study area. There's critical habitat for these mussels, but there's also primarily groundwater withdrawals. So this is all the surface water withdrawals that are permitted for agriculture. And then these are all the groundwater withdrawals. And this is important to point out because in these irrigation reduction auctions, groundwater was not included thus far. So these mussels are not faring too well. They have been pretty much extirpated, or at least the fat three-ridge has been almost entirely extirpated from the region. And then since 1990, everything that's listed in yellow has had massive declines of more than 50% of their population. And I'd like to say this is sort of anomalous, but unfortunately it's not. This is part of a bigger trend of freshwater mussel population declines around the southeastern region. And it's really unfortunate because the southeastern U.S. actually has some of the highest mussel diversity, freshwater mussel diversity in the world. So mussels have a complex life cycle. Just a little bit about it. Wrong button. They have an almost parasitic life stage where their young, or Glaucidia, are released and attached to the gills of host fish species. And then the fish species will transport these mussels to suitable habitat where they're released, and then they grow back into what we think of as a mussel. So part of the problem with managing for mussels is it's complicated. You not only need to provide suitable habitat for the mussels themselves, but also for their host fish species. And unfortunately, the timing when the Glaucidia are released coincides with the highest withdrawal for irrigation agriculture throughout the year and the hot, dry season. Now, it's important for enough water to be there, not only for the glucidity to be released, but also for the fish to be able to reach the mussels, so you need connectivity. But you also need enough water, even for adults, to not desiccate or dry out. This is a picture from Spring Creek during, I think it was the 2008 drought, where entire reaches of this creek are drying, exposing adult mussels, and ultimately killing them. So I'm going to not go too deeply into the policy, but a brief context. There's like sort of three main regulatory drivers shaping management of the mussels. At the federal level, there's the Endangered Species Act. And then at the state level, there's the Flint River Drought Protection Act, and then more recently, the Georgia State Water Plan. Now, the Endangered Species Act, these were only listed in 1998. And then shortly after, in 2000, the Flint River Drought Protection Act was passed, and then the first 2 years after, they had these irrigation reduction auctions. Now, an important thing to point out, though, is these auctions happened before the EPD, the Environmental Protection Division, even really knew much about the mussels and what they needed. They didn't pass the plan of how to manage these mussels until a few years after the irrigation reduction auctions are passed. And then also, in 2006, this plan was updated, which now has this provision to include groundwater in these auctions, but there haven't actually been auctions held since then, so there hasn't been an ability to test, how this is going to go, how they would include groundwater, how farmers would be paid for it. And so our research really focuses on ways to value groundwater in future auctions. So let me talk a bit about my methods, or our methods. We used a model called DSAT, or the Decision Support System for Agri-Technology Transfer. And what this did is it took the main crops grown in the region, which are peanuts, corn, soybean, and cotton. It took these crops, it optimized sort of what they would need throughout the growing season based on conditions, soil moisture, that sort of thing, and also based on what farmers are likely to do to optimize their utility. And what this came out with is an irrigation threshold and planting schedule. So it let us know what is needed for water at what times of the year, spatially. Now, these results are put into another model called SAM2, and this is a stream-aquifer model. And what this model really does, simply, is it tells you for every gallon of water that you take out of the ground, how much that's going to take out of the stream. There's connectivity between the groundwater and the stream in this area. It's variable, and so this lets you know which wells make a bigger difference for water withdrawals. And these data were then combined with other data to create a damage function. And I'm going to talk more about this in slides, but really what we did is took how much impact the withdrawals are making. We combined that with the stream reach sensitivity to drying. Certain reaches are more likely to dry during droughts than others based on their shape and sort of their location. And then also we took biological data, and so we did a proximity analysis, so how close these wells were or withdrawals were to where the mussels are actually living, because they have a very spotty distribution within the watershed. Okay, so here's some initial results. Let me talk a little bit first about how the first irrigation reduction auctions occurred. So they, on average, in 2001, the average bid accepted was about $136 per acre to not irrigate for the season. And it cost them about $4.5 million to take out the amount of acres that they were trying to take out of irrigation. They did it again in 2002. They capped the bidding system, and the average bid accepted was a bit lower, and they took more out of production for a higher price, for about $5 million. And so what happened, the way that the EPD chose which acres to take out of production, which farmers, to give, to accept their bids, they chose the lowest cost bids until the target number of acres were removed. Now, we think, based on our results, we think there's a different way to go about this. And so let me explain a little bit more about the results. What you see in this very top left image, this is where all the mussels are located, like population sites of mussels are located within the watershed. The width of the stream is sort of how sensitive it is to drying, with the wider reaches being more sensitive to drying. Right here, we have the results of sort of the flux calculations, and the dots are all permanent wells, and then the bigger the dot and the redder the dot, the more impact it made on the stream for withdrawals, and the smaller, the more purple the dot, sort of the less impact that it made. And with these ones making very negligible impact, actually, on stream flows. And so what we found as far as flux to withdrawal ratios, what made the bigger difference, the permanent wells that had a really high pumping rate and that were close to the river made sort of a bigger difference than other permanent wells. So what we're suggesting, well, first, if you include groundwater in the sort of auction process and you just give farmers $150 per acre, even groundwater withdrawals, even the ones that are sort of don't make a big difference on streams. So if you give them all $150 per acre, it would cost about $500,000 to take out, this certain amount that we're looking at. But if you pay them based on flux to withdrawal ratio, you have huge savings sort of in what you can take out of production. Huge savings. But even without just using flux to withdrawal ratios, we think that there would be a way to increase the benefit gained to mussels per money spent by the EPD by changing their selection criteria. And we propose that they use something along the lines of conservation value, where they choose the areas that have the most conservation value first, rather than going solely based on bids. And so our selection criteria, again, would be flux to withdrawal ratio. So those wells that make the biggest difference would get chosen first. Reach sensitivity to drying and proximity to mussel populations. And surface water withdrawals could also be included within the scheme. They would just have a flux to withdrawal ratio of 1. So based on this new scheme, we feel that the EPD could make much bigger impacts to mussel populations. We suggest that the EPD treat surface and groundwater differently in future auctions, and they use, at least at the minimum, a flux to withdrawal ratio to value groundwater permits. We suggest they select bids based on conservation value rather than price. And one important thing to point out is if they really are going to be choosing areas with high conservation value first, the $150 per acre value honestly might not be an accurate willingness to pay, and it might behoove them to see if raising that price per acre, but really only targeting the areas that are going to make a bigger difference would be appropriate. Because there has been studies that show that this $150 per acre value isn't high enough to take out a lot of the higher value crops out of production, which really are a big portion of the crops grown in this region. So you're getting a lot of marginal farmland, things that farmers wouldn't even really be irrigating a lot in the first place that they're buying out of production right now. Also, there's really a big data need. As for many sort of endangered species, we don't exactly know the relative impacts of drought versus other things like water quality. And so we suggest that they do studies to sort of determine the relative impacts to see if irrigation reduction auctions really are the best use of money to protect mussels. And with that, I would like to thank Laura Fowler, my advisor, the River Basin Center, the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences, the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center, and USGS and the Georgia EPD. I can take questions.